Welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm your host, Henry Smith. Today, I'm pleased to welcome archaeologist Abigail Van Huss back to the Digging for Truth program. Abby, it's great to have you back on our show again. Welcome.
It's good to be here.
Well, it's great to see you again. Now, Abby, we've had you on the show before, and actually one of the episodes where you shared your journey to becoming an archaeologist as pretty much a young girl, and all the way up to the moment that you are now, basically ready to complete your PhD. And so we're very pleased with that. You're getting close, right?
Yeah.
Well, today we're going to talk specifically about some of the research that you're doing, a specific area of research. It has to do with archaeology and what we call the Central Hill Country, or sometimes in our Old Testaments, this is translated as the mountains, right, in the Joshua and Judges narratives.
Right.
So if you could give us a little intro to maybe the biblical background of that, and then bridge that over to the bigger archaeological picture that you've been kind of working on.
Yeah. So biblically, it starts with Abraham. He comes into the land and we see him traveling up and down this central ridge route. We see him going from Shechem down to Hebron. Jerusalem's on that route. Bethel's on that route. And he's hitting all these sites going up and down this central ridge route, because Israel, you have the Mediterranean Sea on one side, the Jordan Valley on the other, and then in between is this mountain ridge that comes up in the center of the country and that runs almost the entire length of that region there. And so we have this central ridge. Abraham's familiar with it. Of course, his son and grandson, we see Jacob traveling up and down this ridge. But the Israelites go down to Egypt and they're in bondage. And when they come back, it takes them a while, it takes them 40 years, but they finally cross the Jordan into that Jordan River Valley on the western side. They conquer Jericho, and then the first thing they do is they go up that hill. They go up into the highlands, into the Central Hill Country, and they're conquering. They conquer Ai. They go to Mount Ebal there, and it ends up that this is really where a lot of them settle, is in these Central Hills. And there's some reasons they have a hard time conquering the cities down in the lowlands, and so we see them getting pushed into these Central Hills. So archaeologically, we should find evidence of that Israelite settlement there in the Central Hill Country. And so that's what I'm looking at for my PhD topic, is I'm looking at the transition from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age in the Central Hill Country of Israel. And so we have these two archaeological periods, the late Bronze Age, and the transitions to the Iron Age around 1200 BC. That's kind of the traditional date. There's maybe some adjustments. 1177 might be a better date. But we see this transition happening archaeologically to where we go kind of from one material culture and one way of living to a different one. And this is, a lot of times associated with the Israelites showing up there. Of course, on the coast, we have another transition happening, and this is with the arrival of the Philistines. So the Philistines are showing up on the coast. The Israelites show up in the Central Hill Country, and we have this change going on. And so when I decided that I was going to study this transition in the Central Hill Country, what I had to do is figure out what exactly is the Central Hill Country. I mean, we know what it is. We know it's that central ridge in the middle of the country. But when you're going to study something and specifically look at all the sites within a specific region, you need to know exactly where the borders of that region are. And when I started looking into it, I realized it's kind of hard to define exactly where those borders are. And so that's kind of what I'm looking at. And what we're, I think, going to talk about today is those borders for the Central Hill Country, and how we can figure out, if we can figure out, what exactly those borders are.
Yeah. So if I understand maybe the bigger picture correctly, you correct me if I'm wrong and fill it in, and if I'm right. We have the Israelites taking the land initially, and we have some texts that say, you're going to live in houses that you did not build, and you're going to have arable land that you didn't prepare, and these kind of cities, that kind of thing. And the Israelites come in the land really without an established material culture, because they've been wandering in the wilderness. So talk a little bit about, that intermediate period where they're settling in, and what do we know about some of that? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so what we see is archaeologically, um, in the late Bronze Age, the the Central Hill Country is almost empty. Now, it's not probably empty, but the big cities of the Middle Bronze Age are gone. There's a few main centers, and we see this that there it's just everybody living in these tight little centers, and the rest of the area is there's just no cities, no settlements, no towns, whatever. And so archaeologically it seems empty. And then we have this sudden shift with the beginning of the Iron Age, where it's suddenly full of brand new settlements all over the place. And so, but I think this might give us kind of the wrong idea in our heads, because we think, oh, where we see all these new settlements, that's when they showed up. But I think it's not, and I think we have some hints, and we'll talk about it a little bit. From the Amarna letters, we see that the land is full of nomads, that they're not settled down necessarily. There are people who are coming in who are outsiders, and so we see that the land, which looks empty archaeologically because we don't see the remains of cities, it's actually full of people who are nomadic in nature. And so they're coming in and they're attacking the cities, and they're trying to take ground, and they do take some. Um, but but then when we see the settlement, I think that's when the nomads are actually starting to settle down and build their own houses. So that's a later phase. Whereas the earlier ones, they're either living in tents or, like you said, and like God promised them, they do conquer some of the Canaanite cities, and they're living in houses they didn't build, drinking from cisterns they didn't dig, and it's just like God promised them.
Yeah, that's I think that's really helpful. So it's the what is the proper interpretation of that sort of lack of material footprint, I think is kind of what you're
Hmm.
saying. And a plausible explanation, we believe, is they were Bedouin in the desert for 40 years. They were not
Hmm.
connected to, it was their own culture, and they had to live that way. They enter the land and they kind of keep living the same kind of way. Am I at least at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Is that
And
kind of what you're thinking?
yeah, and I know that they were in Egypt for a long time, and that could mess with their culture. But even think about back to the time of the patriarchs, they're living that way. They're nomads. They're traveling up and down that ridge route seasonally, which even today shepherds do that. Shepherds from the Hebron area will go up to the Shechem area seasonally. And so that's just like a known phenomenon that still happens today. But Abraham's doing that. And then the Israelites go down to Egypt and they tell Pharaoh, we're shepherds, give us land where we can raise our sheep, basically. And so they're still living that lifestyle of shepherds. So yeah, they settled into Egypt for quite a while, but coming out, they pick up that lifestyle again, and they have all their flocks and herds, and they're just living this nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle, I think.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I think that's a great survey to introduce our viewers to the subject. So we're going to take a break now, Abby, and then we'll be right back after this message.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with archaeologist Abigail Van Huss, and we're talking about the settlement of the Israelites in the Central Hill Country in the Judges period. So, Abby, one of the things that you note in your research that people know about, and of course you've explored this more, is this sort of transition, from the late Bronze Age to what we call the Iron Age.
Mhm.
Around 1200, some people dated 1177 specifically. You mentioned that. So, what are some of the things that you see from an archaeological perspective about that time of transition in the material culture that we see?
Well, one thing is that we're changing from a culture that is a little more sophisticated, actually. The Middle Bronze Age, that we see a lot of trade, and that continues into the Late Bronze Age, although a little less, like things are collapsing a little bit. Like I mentioned before, we have these people are all centered in tight little clusters in cities, and they're not spread out as much. So a lot of the population that was there is something's changed. But in the late Bronze Age, it's interesting. I was plotting on a map where we find imported pottery in the Central Hill Country, because imported pottery, especially Cypriot pottery, was a huge deal in the late Bronze Age. But in the Central Hill Country, you only see it at sites that are along the Patriarch's Highway, that Central Ridge route. So it's only people who are living right on the highway that are having access to trade. Everybody else just doesn't have those imported goods. So, but when we go to the Iron Age, that stops. So one thing is we see that we don't have imported pottery anymore. Another thing is that the pottery kind of changes, and it goes from being really nice and fine and delicate to being kind of big and clunky and ugly. And so that's another thing. So we're seeing this change in the pottery. We're seeing changes. We're seeing less interactions with Egypt, whereas in the Bronze Age, we see more of the scarab seals, which are Egyptian style. In the Iron Age, we start to see what we call conical seals, which aren't shaped like a beetle, so that's a different style. So we have all these changes going on, and then we have the fact that we just suddenly have all this settlement happening that isn't there. Like I said, I think it was nomads living there during the late Bronze Age that aren't leaving as much as of an archaeological footprint. And then they settle down. And so there's this whole transition happening archaeologically. We see some destruction of cities going on, although not so much in the Central Hill Country. That's interestingly not a huge phenomenon there, but of course in the surrounding regions we're seeing destructions of cities that show up. And so it's just like all these changes going on, and something's happening, something big is happening that's clear in the archaeological record, but figuring out the exact timing and the way it happened is kind of one of my goals.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I wanted to backtrack a little bit to your description of the change in the pottery. You called it clunky and unrefined. Was that are those
Like
technical terms?
Oh, I'm pretty sure ugly pottery is definitely a technical term. We use it all the time.
Yeah. So what is your interpretation of that? That's obviously a shift in the way that people make the pottery, right? Mm-hmm. And their skill perhaps is you can infer. Tell us what that might mean.
Yeah, I think that there's a change. And for one thing, we're seeing less imported pottery and therefore copying less imported pottery, because in the late Bronze Age culture, you have imports and then you have local copies of imports. Whereas in the Iron Age, you don't have those imports. And so you don't have copies of them. So one thing is that this culture that is the Iron Age is not so worried about fine ware, and maybe not so capable of making it. We see them coming in. If we're talking about the Israelites coming out of Egypt, they probably weren't potters in Egypt. They may have had potters, but and maybe just this is life. This is a hard life, settling the hill country. The Bible says it's full of trees, and Joshua told him you're going to have to cut down the trees. So these are people who are like settling and roughing it, and maybe they just don't have time to figure out how to make good pottery. But it's definitely something outside of the established system, so to speak, of pottery making in the Central Hill Country, because we see that the Canaanites know how to make good pottery, and then the Israelites apparently just don't.
Would you say there's general agreement that it's agreed upon that this is Israelite? I know we come from a conservative perspective related
Mm-hmm.
to the history of the Bible. Obviously, there's a spectrum of views. Do even the more skeptical scholars generally consider this to be Israelite pottery? Do they agree with that, or what do you think of the sort of views on that?
Yeah, there's this huge trend away from identifying cultures based on the material remains that they leave behind. And so I think probably the secular view would be that, yes, there's something different going on, whether it's a different people group or whether it's just people who are adapting to a new way of life. They don't want to attach any ethnicity to it. But I think they would all agree that these are the people who at least became the Israelites, is probably where they would go with that. Because yeah, it is generally agreed that these are either the Israelites or forerunners of them.
Yeah. I kind of thought it was something along those lines. And our interpretation from the biblical text, when you bring the two together, it seems pretty clear to be Israelites from our perspective. All right, let's shift a little bit. We got about a minute in this segment. Maybe you could give an overview of maybe some of the difficulties associated with defining the borders. You mentioned that in the intro. Tell us a little bit about those difficulties and whatever you want to explain about that.
Yeah, so this is something I ran into. I was like, okay, I'm studying the Central Hill Country, but what is that? And so I'm looking geographically, like surely there's got to be geographical borders, but you see the hills, they come down and then they kind of dissipate and they turn into the lowlands, and then you're in the valleys or the coastal plain. And like I couldn't find a line, like a dividing line. It just kind of gradually transitions. And so then I looked climatologically, like where does the rain cut off? And that didn't help me either, because you have the south where there's no rain and the north where there's more rain. And so like climatological borders didn't work. So I'm going through all of these steps trying to figure out, okay, where exactly is the edge of the Central Hill Country? And so then I thought, well, like, where did ancient people see it as? And so that's where we get into textual references. And for this, I found two sources that were mostly helpful. One is the Amarna letters, and then one is the biblical books of Joshua and Judges. And so in the Amarna letters, what we see is that we have these city-states, and each city-state is under the rule of Egypt. Egypt is in charge. Everybody pays taxes to Egypt. But there are these city-state rulers or kings or mayors or whatever you want to call them. And they're kind of small pockets. And then some of them are trying to conquer other cities or take towns that belong to other cities. And so there's a lot of back and forth. But what I discovered as I went through this is that you kind of have your two main city-states in the Central Hill Country. You've got Jerusalem in the south, and you've got Shechem in the north. And they're kind of warring with each other. They're warring with other people down in the lowlands. And they probably didn't even see their territories the way we would think of it. Like we look at a map and we draw a line around the United States of America or something.
Right.
That's not how they really saw it, probably. They probably were like, I control this town and that town and that town and that town. And maybe the stuff in between is kind of under my control. But trying to draw a line around it just doesn't work. And then in Joshua and Judges, we see, oh, there's really nice tribal divisions. Like they get divided up. It tells us the line goes from this town to this town to this town. And that's really nice. But then in the end, they don't end up controlling all of that. And so once again, I'm running into problems like where are the borders of the Central Hill Country? Because these tribes, they stretch from the coast all the way up to the top, or from the ridge all the way down to the Jordan. And so we really don't see politically either a definition of the Central Hill Country. So that there's another problem that I run into.
Sure. Well, we're going to explore this problem a little bit more, Abby, as we take a break, and we'll be right back after this message. Are you interested in digging even deeper for the truth? Then please visit the ABR website at BibleArchaeology.org and click on Bookstore. There you'll find a wide variety of resources designed to defend the Christian faith. Archaeology, apologetics, the text of Scripture, creation evolution, even study Bibles. You can pick up the perfect gift for the sincere seeker or fellow Christian. Visit Bible Archaeology and click on Bookstore today. Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with archaeologist Abigail Van Huss. Okay, Abigail, we were talking about the borders in the Central Hill Country, right? So you were talking about some of the changes that took place and also how it's described in Joshua and Judges. Let's keep going.
Yeah, so we see these tribal allotments, um, but what happens is they don't seem to cut off where we would want borders for the Central Hill Country. They kind of ignore that's a region. Um, but once again, we interestingly see a north and south division. We had this in the Amarna letters with Jerusalem versus Shechem, these two city states that are warring. And then in Joshua and Judges, we again see this where you have Judah kind of in the south, Judah and Benjamin, and then you have Manasseh and Ephraim in the north. And this is eventually going to lead to the split between the southern and northern kingdoms of Judah and Israel. Even that early, it's kind of starting to show up that there is kind of this segregation north to south, but it still just doesn't help with like what's going on specifically in the Central Hill Country, because the region is still broader at that time.
So the descriptions of the borders in Joshua and Judges are sort of what God designates to the Israelites, but there's some ambiguity as to finding that on the ground, A, and B, the way it plays out in history. The Israelites do a lot of stuff to be unfaithful to God, so there's a lot of things that happen. Is that generally what you're saying? Am I right about that?
I think we have this idea of the idealized, like, here's what your borders should be, and then the actual, like, here's how it plays out, because the Israelites, they're kind of afraid, and they say, the Canaanites down in the Jezreel Valley, they have chariots. And we actually find a really interesting correlation in Amarna letter 243, where the mayor of Megiddo, who's in the Jezreel Valley there, he writes to the king of Egypt and he says, these Habiru are coming against me and I'm guarding with chariots. Like, this is all I've got. I've got to guard with my chariots. And the Israelites are telling Joshua, yeah, those Canaanites down in the Jezreel Valley, they have chariots, and so we can't conquer them. And so Joshua tells them, well, you're going to have to live in the Central Hill Country. You're going to have to cut down the trees, and this is just going to have to be enough for you. And so we see this hostility going on to where the Israelites, because of their fear, because they can't conquer those cities, they kind of pull up and they settle in the Central Hill Country. And so that's where we begin to see maybe the dividing line is, out of range of those chariots, wherever that might be, because they end up with a smaller place up in the Central Hill Country, up in the backwoods where nobody really wants to live, but that's where they can settle down and make a home.
Excellent. For folks watching who may not be familiar with the Amarna letters, we have several episodes of Digging for Truth we've done with Dr. Stripling and Dr. Gary Byers on that subject. We encourage you to explore that further. Really fascinating. So, how do you see this archaeological evidence lining up with these written sources that we know about? Like, what do you see as consistent? What do you see as anomalies? Like, what? I guess it sounds like it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, no, I think we do see a lot of consistency because the Amarna letters give us a glimpse into the late Bronze Age. The Canaanites living in the land, and they are in these tight little city states, and that's what we see archaeologically is just the cities are settled, the rest seems empty. Like I said, it's probably full of nomads, but archaeologically it seems empty, which is exactly what we see in the Amarna letters with these city-state rulers that rule their cities and a few little towns, and then the rest of the land is full of Habiru who are causing all kinds of problems. And then in Joshua and Judges, we look at it, and Joshua and Judges describes a place where there are cities that are really hard to conquer or impossible. And then the Israelites are just in there filling up the land. And so I think, for one, it's a correlation between the Amarna letters and the biblical books. But for another, I think in both cases, the text, what we see in the text, really lines up nicely with the archaeology, because the Bible tells us the Israelites ended up settling in the hill country, and that's where they kind of they're kind of centered for a long time there. They bring the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant to Shiloh, and that's their center of worship there. Shiloh is one of those sites right along the Central Ridge Route. And so that kind of becomes the core of Israel, which of course later expands. King David and Solomon, especially when they come along, they're able to expand the territory a lot. But the Central Hill Country continues to be the core of Israel.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that's a great overview of all that evidence. I'm sure you have a lot more to say about it, since this has been the subject of your PhD dissertation. But I just want to say thank you for all your hard work and for coming on the show and sharing just maybe you might call it a tip of the iceberg, right, Abby? Right, Abby?
Yeah, it's there's a lot more beyond that, but yeah, it's fun stuff to look into.
Well, it's been great to have you on the show. We're thankful for the work that you do. We're glad to have you on board as a staff. We ask people to pray for you as well as you complete your PhD studies and get those final letters behind your name. We wish you well with that, Abby. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Henry.
Well, friends, thank you for watching Digging for Truth. As you can see, it's important for us to not only believe what the Bible says and follow that, but also to have expertise on the ground in the world of archaeology. And this has been part of the mission of Associates for Biblical Research. Abigail is part of that story, has been her growth into her studies and her expertise is part of what ABR does. So we ask for your support for our ministry and prayers for our ministry, because this is one of the many components of what our mission is to do excellent archaeological work in the field, to do it well to God's glory, and to ultimately demonstrate how we can trust what the Bible says. And so we appreciate your support, and we thank you for watching today, Digging for Truth.